Hi, everybody. We're going to talk just a little bit today about systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This slide just outlines the process for you of what you want to do if you're considering either a systematic review or a meta-analysis. So you're going to think real clearly what the purpose is. State the purpose and develop a protocol. And in that protocol, you're going to define what the inclusion and exclusion criteria will be for the studies you're going to include. And that's going to depend on what you find in the literature and where the state of the science is around that particular topic. But you're going to develop a search strategy and identify what the keywords are. You're going to define which search engines you'll use, which databases, and then you'll do the search and you'll screen the titles and the abstracts to make sure that they really do include your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then becomes kind of the delving into the meatier part of this and critiquing the selected studies. And you critique those in the same way that you've been critiquing the articles for this class. Then you need to synthesize those findings. You need to pull together. So given the strength of these studies and what they found, what do I determine to be the significant findings? And if there are statistical data that are sufficient for further analysis, then you're going to analyze the effect sizes and go on to do a meta-analysis. If you do not have either the type of studies that can be included in a meta-analysis, or if you just don't have sufficient data from those studies to conduct a meta-analysis, then you'll go ahead and do a systematic review. But if they're quantitative studies that have looked at differences between groups on an intervention, even if you don't find what you need in the article, you might reach out to the authors and ask them for more information and include them in a meta-analysis whenever possible. So when you're defining your study objective, it goes back to asking that question. And it begins with a well-defined question or purpose statement. And the foundation for locating the appropriate references for review, or the appropriate studies that you want to review, really comes from that well-defined question or purpose statement. So you want to then go to intervention studies that include a treatment, an outcome, and the population characteristics, so that you can determine who these outcomes apply to. You also want to ask the question about what diagnostic tools or what outcomes did they use, what tests or measures, were there reference standards, and did they have well-defined outcomes? You also want to critique the background and research rationale. And again, all of the things you've learned up to this point in this class about critiquing studies applies here. So how are you going to decide on the selection criteria? You want to specify the characteristics of the study. And again, this comes from that thorough critique of the literature and a thorough review. And as I've mentioned in here before, I strongly encourage you to work with the librarians on campus. They'll do it virtually. And really make sure you have identified everything that's out there that could inform your understanding of the state of the science around this topic. So determine the level of evidence that's been out there. If all you can find on this topic is qualitative and descriptive, then you're not going to do a meta-analysis. You can't. But if you determine the level of evidence is that there are several randomized controlled trials, but nobody's really conducted a meta-analysis, that's where the level of the evidence is, and that should be what you do in your synthesis of the literature. If there's enough data, go ahead and do a meta-analysis. You also want to identify the types of participants. So you can say, this has worked in this population. I'm not sure if it's going to work in my population, but I think there's enough evidence that we should give it a try. And then you also want to specify the types of intervention and outline the outcomes that they measured. Sometimes when you try to do this, you won't have exactly the same outcomes in each study, but you may determine that the concepts are the same and that they just operationally defined it a little different and use different outcome measures. And you can decide if you think those need to be combined in a meta-analysis. So your search strategy, you're gonna do a thorough literature search, and as I've said, you'll work with a librarian to make sure you get everything. You also want to include any systematic reviews that have been done on this topic. If there's already been a systematic review published in 2020 on this, and it's pretty complete and thorough, and you don't feel like you know of anything missing, that's sufficient to move forward to say, here's the review of the literature. But if you don't have a systematic review, or it's an old systematic review and you feel like additional things have been conducted that would inform your work, you may want to either conduct an additional systematic review or a meta-analysis, depending on the level of the data that's presented. So use systematic reviews. Somebody's already done the work of combining or synthesizing the past research for you. You also want to include gray literature to eliminate the possibility of publication bias. So gray literature might be things that are presented at a conference but not yet published. They may be things that you hear about that colleagues are doing in your institution, but they haven't been written up. The gray literature just refers to things that have not yet been published. It's also difficult to get studies with negative findings published, and that's where that bias comes in. So you want to include gray literature if you can find it. You want to also describe what databases you've searched and the key terms you've used. So here's an example of an evidence table that I know you can't read the individual details, but it's just one way to set up an evidence table as you're pulling together the systematic review, and it gives you the author and the date, a little, the citation, so the details of the paper so you can go find it, what methods they used, what their objectives were, what their outcomes were, and the number of patients. And this is just one way to summarize and keep track. And I highly recommend that you begin doing this for everything you read as you move through your coursework, because it's just going to make things easier as you get toward your final project or dissertation. So then typically what happens in a systematic review or a meta-analysis is that you have two independent reviewers who evaluate the methodological quality. And again, you've been trained to do that in this class. And if two of you get together and go through the articles in the systematic way that you've been taught to critique research in this course, that would be a good way to approach it for a systematic review and or meta-analysis. And you want to use established criteria. So if it's an RCT, your consort criteria. And you're going to compare then, after you both have critiqued it, you're going to get together and compare and reach consensus. Talk through how you evaluated the studies and why. You really want to pay close attention to any sources of error. So do you think there was selection bias? The random assignment and blinded studies are the strongest, but as we've talked about before, are not always possible. So you really want to pay attention to that. Performance bias, blinded patients and evaluators. And again, that's not always feasible, but when feasible, it's the strongest. Attrition bias, differential loss of subjects across groups, is a weakness that you have to acknowledge. So even if they have great outcomes, if you lost half of the control group, you don't really know what happened. And then detection bias, the outcomes assessment differed across the comparison groups. So that would be a problem as well. There's a variety of rating scales that you can use to help guide you through this. And you can look at the JDAD scale, which is an instrument to measure the likelihood of bias. You can use the Pedro scale, which is a physiotherapy evidence database for rehab. There's a QUADAS scale, which is quality assessment of diagnostic accuracy. It's a 14-item scale specifically designed for diagnostic instruments. There's the AmStar scale with its methodological quality of systematic reviews. And I have, I think, an example of that from one of the studies that we published in your course. We used the AmStar criteria. And then there's the Melnick and Fine-Overholt rapid critical appraisal questions for different types of study. And they talk about looking at validity, treatment effect, clinically important risk, benefits, feasibility, and patient values and preferences. But just use some kind of scale to help you evaluate the studies. As you're evaluating the literature, another resource that you might find helpful is something that you can find on this link, this YouTube video. It's an AHRQ online reference that assists in creating a data abstraction form, and you can take a look at that if you'd like. So here's an example of a flowchart you then create, and you describe where you found the studies that you're pulling. So you do your lit search, and again, I can't emphasize enough that you need to work with a librarian who's good at finding things that you can't find, maybe. So you may be searching PubMed, you may be searching Cochrane, you may include CINAHL, and this particular example found 108 studies through PubMed, 28 through the Cochrane reviews, and 95 through CINAHL. And then they combined those and said the citations from all the electronic databases were 231. And then they excluded 80 of those because they were general articles and didn't meet their specific criteria. Or they could tell right away that they weren't on the topic specific enough. And then that left them with 151 articles selected for review. And then after reviewing those, They eliminated 5 because they were non-English, 68 because they weren't relevant, 62 RCT, quasi-descriptive, and 5 qualitative. So they ended up with articles for final inclusion as just 11. And that's because they had real tight inclusion and exclusion criteria and really well-defined process. So here is how they critiqued these articles using the AmStar criteria. So the AmStar criteria are 11 criteria that are listed at the bottom of this table for you. So reported an a priori design, reported duplicate study selection and data extraction, reported conducting a comprehensive literature review, reported publication status of included studies, reported a list of included and excluded studies, reported the characteristics of the included studies, reported the quality of those studies, and the quality and appropriateness in the formulating conclusions, and then were appropriate methods used to combine the study, and was publication bias assessed, and was the conflict of interest stated. So you can see the Y's are yes, the N's are no. The CA is can't answer or there wasn't data available. So you can see how they rated the studies in this particular review. So a question for you to consider: a systematic review is often performed after a meta-analysis, and the answer to that would be false. You would do a meta-analysis after the systematic review. And remember, as we described before, it depends on the level of the studies, whether or not you can do the meta-analysis. But the meta-analysis always follows the systematic review if it can be done at all. So let's talk about selection criteria when you're doing a systematic review. So you can check the appropriate boxes here. So determine the level of evidence. You cannot determine the sample size. You can't identify the keywords until you've begun the literature search, but you can specify the type of participants. You can specify the type of intervention, and you can outline the outcome measures. So that kind of concludes what we have to say about meta-analysis and systematic review. And as you know, the assignment for this course is actually to conduct a meta-analysis using data in the assignment, and the meta-analysis calculation worksheet that's also in your Canvas course shell. So I hope you have some fun conducting this meta-analysis, and you have a better understanding of what a systematic review and meta-analysis entail. Good luck.